Chicken giant Tyson Foods says it's closing 4 processing plants, including 2 here in Missouri.
And it breaks my heart because it's our history. I've lived here my whole life.
This is a disaster for America. You walk into a grocery store in Texas and pick up a package of beef labeled Made in USA, but what you don't know is that it was processed by a Canadian company inside a factory that once belonged to Tyson Foods, now under new ownership. Tyson, once a symbol of American food power, just shut down 5 major plants. Not because we ran out of cattle, but because America no longer has control over its costs, its supply chains, or even its own support policies. And while U.S. agriculture struggles to breathe under the weight of inflation and crisis, Canada suddenly steps in, offering to take over those plants, to produce meat for Americans right here on U.S. soil. The terrifying question is, if even our meals now rely on another country to operate, what does America still truly control? And if this trend spreads, who will really be running everyday life in America tomorrow? Canada emerges rival or successor. No one expected Canada, once seen as the underdog in America's tariff wars, to become a central player in the U.S. red meat game. Just a few years ago, when former President Donald Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian agricultural imports to protect American farmers, many assumed Ottawa would retreat, lose market share, and eventually fall in line with Washington's rules. But that scenario never played out. In fact, Canada didn't back down. They quietly prepared for a role reversal. When Tyson Foods, a titan of the American meat industry, announced the closure of 5 plants in less than 2 years, it wasn't just a sign of corporate decline. It was a glaring hole in the very supply chain America once proudly claimed to dominate. And in the chilling silence from Washington, officials Canada stepped forward, formally offering to take over those abandoned facilities. Not to export to Europe, not to ship cheap goods back to Canadian supermarkets. Canada made its intentions clear. They want to run those plants right on American soil to produce meat for Americans. At first glance, it sounds generous, but look closer and it's a surgical strike at the very weakness crippling America today: the loss of internal control. Canada's Ministry of Agriculture didn't deny it. Officials admitted they had proactively approached several U.S. partners after Tyson's shutdowns. One spokesperson even stated, "We don't want American consumers to suffer from a production crisis. If we have the capacity, the standards, and the workforce, why shouldn't we help?" It sounds reasonable, but that logic reveals a deeper irony. Canada, once the victim of U.S. tariffs, is now sitting behind the wheel of America's food supply. No need to buy up brands. No need to undercut with cheap pricing. All they had to do was wait until the competitor lost its balance. The story grew more serious when reports emerged that at least 2 Canadian food companies had submitted bids to acquire Tyson's old plants in Pennsylvania and Arkansas facilities that once pumped out millions of pounds of beef each month for domestic supply. Their proposals included retaining American workers, preserving the existing processing lines, and keeping the same distribution channels, but all operations would run under Canadian management and standards. Here, the line between partnership and control begins to blur. American consumers may still see familiar logos on their packaging. They'll still shop at Walmart or Kroger. But the price point, inspection criteria, and product release schedules, all of it could now be determined by a foreign entity. If this were a story about a Vietnamese firm taking over a Chinese power plant, or a Swiss company running a seaport in Africa, the American media would be quick to sound the alarm over dependency. But when the same thing happens on U.S. soil and the foreign player was once penalized by America's own tariff policy, the silence is unsettling. Canada isn't making headlines with political fanfare. No fiery press conferences, no sweeping declarations. They arrive with strategy, with workforce readiness, with stable logistics. And most importantly, they arrive at the exact moment America doesn't know what to do with its empty factories. Some call it a quiet transfer of soft power. No bullets, no trade war, just patience, timing, and persistence. Canada isn't stealing America's market, they're simply picking up what America left behind. No need for loud victories, just a deep enough collapse from the other side. So in the end, is Canada a rival or an heir? Maybe they don't need to define their role anymore, because while the US remains tangled in internal confusion, Canada has already moved on. And sometimes history isn't written by the strongest player, but by the one who knows when to step forward, while the others are too exhausted to act. Tyson Foods, a fallen giant crushed by policy and system failure. If America's food industry were a towering structure standing tall over its farmlands, then Tyson Foods would be the keystone at its peak, a convergence of production, strength, supply chain mastery, and brand trust built over half a century. But that tower is now trembling, not from a single storm, but from the gradual erosion beneath its foundation, flawed policies, rising inflation, and a silent collapse in U.S. agriculture. Tyson had survived it all: animal disease outbreaks, skyrocketing logistics costs, and fierce competition from Brazil and Mexico. But in 2025, the force that finally brought them to their knees wasn't foreign. It was a string of so-called protective policies that ended up isolating the company instead of shielding it. Let's rewind for a moment. When former President Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on countries like Canada, China, and Brazil, the goal was to revive American agriculture, support farmers, and encourage domestic production. But the long-term effect was quite the opposite. Input costs skyrocketed, especially for feed staples like corn and soybeans, the lifeblood of meat production. According to the USDA, corn prices in Q1 2025 jumped 17.4% year over year. Soybean prices surged nearly 22%. These aren't abstract figures, they translate into millions of dollars in added monthly costs for companies like Tyson just to maintain current output. As inputs became scarce and expensive, the pressure funneled directly onto farmers and processors. Tyson, instead of being protected as intended, was caught in a chokehold raw material, costs soaring on one end, while retail prices couldn't keep pace because inflation was crushing consumer spending. And then the inevitable happened. Tyson announced the closure of its Emporia plant in Kansas, a facility employing over 800 workers and serving as a vital link in the Midwest beef distribution chain. Shortly after the Philadelphia plant was shut down, too, affecting 29 direct employees, not to mention hundreds of auxiliary workers and small-scale suppliers. According to Arkansas Business and Reuters, at least 5 Tyson facilities have been closed or are under transfer within an 18-month span, wiping out over 1,000 jobs and tearing a critical hole in the domestic supply system. But the most damaging loss wasn't in headcount, it showed up in the numbers. In its Q1 2025 financial report, Tyson Foods posted a net loss of $258 million in its beef division alone, according to SEC filings. This marked the company's worst quarterly loss in over a decade, a staggering plunge in a crisis that no one caught in time. What's more striking, even as Tyson shut its doors, Americans didn't stop buying meat. They simply turned to imports and foreign competitors waiting to fill the gap. In early 2025, countries like Canada, Brazil, and even Argentina ramped up their beef exports to the EU. The demand was there. What failed was America's ability to meet it from within. Some might argue that this is just a market adjustment or a corporate restructuring for efficiency. But the real question is, if even a titan like Tyson can't survive the very system designed to support it, what hope is there for smaller players? If Tyson, with its cutting-edge facilities, industry expertise, and decades of partnerships, can't weather the storm, how can America possibly hold on to its agricultural superpower status? In this context, Tyson's downfall is no longer just a corporate tale. It's a symbol of a system that grew too confident in its own invincibility. Because in truth, nothing is immune to collapse, not when trust policy and logistics all begin to unravel at once. Americans lose their land, their jobs, while Canadians run the factories. In Emporia, Kansas, once considered the heart of America's beef processing industry, the machines went silent for weeks. But then something no one expected happened. The plant wasn't torn down, it wasn't sealed off indefinitely. Instead, the lights came back on under a different name from a different country. Before locals could even catch their breath from losing their jobs, they were hit with a bitter truth: Canada was now running the show on American soil. A coalition of Canadian food companies submitted a formal proposal to Tyson and local authorities, lease the entire facility, operate the existing lines, and hire back American workers to process meat for the US market. No exporting, no shifting production to Canada, no rebranding. Everything stays the same except the owner. At first glance, it sounded generous, saving local jobs, restarting rural economies, keeping domestic goods on the shelves. But behind that seemingly noble gesture lies a sobering reality. Americans are slowly becoming workers inside a food chain now run by the very nation they once hit with tariffs. In Philadelphia, another shuttered Tyson plant is currently under negotiation with a food investor based in Ontario. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the goal is to convert the old facility into a poultry processing center serving the northeastern U.S. market, keeping most of the original workforce but under new management. This shift has left many locals in limbo. If they reject the deal, they lose their jobs and watch their communities wither. If they accept it, they set a dangerous precedent that production sovereignty can be handed over quietly through a simple lease agreement. At a tense town hall meeting in Jefferson County, Iowa, where another Tyson facility is in talks for transfer, one elderly farmer spoke out. "We can go without this plant for a few years. But if we let foreign hands control every line of beef production, we'll lose everything from quality control to the ability to recover when crisis hits." And yet, with job shortages, slashed local budgets, and tax revenue no longer covering teacher salaries, many municipalities are reluctantly saying yes. As one county commissioner in Pennsylvania bluntly put it, "We need the jobs. Whether there's an American or Canadian flag flying outside that factory, people still need paychecks." And that's the most chilling part. Canada doesn't need to invade, doesn't need to buy everything outright. They just lease, preserve, and gradually operate the entire value chain on US soil, using American laws, American labor, but reaping profits and making decisions from north of the border. From a broader perspective, market analysts are sounding the alarm. If this trend continues, the United States risks losing control over its own food supply chain. Allowing critical plants to fall under foreign management, even under the guise of leasing, opens the door to long-term vulnerabilities in strategy and food security. And when Canadians are running the operations, Americans are clocking in as labor, and the Made in USA label is directed by Canadian standards and strategy. The question becomes, are Americans still truly in control of their food industry? No bullets were fired. No buildings collapsed. But right in the heart of America, a new kind of loss of control is taking shape, quiet, legal, and irreversible. Americans may not notice it today, but by the time they do, it might no longer belong to them at all. How Canada operates differently and why they're winning. If there's one core reason why Canada is steadily taking over North America's food chain, it's this simplicity and consistency. While the US is tangled in a bureaucratic tug-of-war between the USDA and FDA, Canada operates under one streamlined authority, the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Working in tandem with the Ministry of Health, the CFIA oversees everything from quality checks and food safety to traceability. A single QR code on Canadian beef packaging can instantly track the product back to the farm, the animal's feed slaughter date, and even microbiological testing results, all within seconds. Now contrast that with the US, where food inspection is a bureaucratic maze. The USDA handles red meat, poultry, and eggs. The FDA oversees processed foods, fish, dairy, and produce. So when a hamburger plant processes both beef and lettuce, companies are left scratching their heads. Who do we get approval from? Which standards apply? What rules kick in if there's a recall? This administrative fragmentation paralyzes innovation. A basic inspection process in the US can take up to 36 hours, bogged down by 3 overlapping agencies. Meanwhile, in Canada, full traceability and safety verification can be done in under 9 hours thanks to AI systems and automated pathogen detection. At a global food tech summit in 2024, CFIA representatives showcased their model. The entire supply chain from farm to grocery shelf is integrated on a single data platform. Any anomaly triggers an automatic red flag. No need for manual reports. No inspectors on standby. The system does the job. This not only helps Canada detect risks earlier, it also slashes compliance costs. According to an OECD report, the average cost of a product recall in Canada is just 60% of that in the US. Why? Because their process is lean, responsibility is clearly assigned, and no redundant paperwork slows things down. Take Missouri, for example. A mid-sized meat company spent 6 weeks reapplying for operating permits just because they raised the height of a conveyor belt. USDA required a full floor plan resubmission. Meanwhile, their Canadian counterpart in Alberta got similar changes approved in just 3 days, thanks to CFIA's digital system and real-time technical support. Canada doesn't need flashy, made-in-Canada ad campaigns to win American customers. They simply earn trust and let their inspection systems speak for themselves. And because of that clean, transparent model, more and more US retailers are signing deals with Canadian processors. Not because the prices are lower, but because the risk is lower. Not because the quality is superior, but because it's easier to avoid dealing with a dozen government agencies when something goes wrong. A supermarket chain in New Jersey told the Wall Street Journal, "When we work with US suppliers, we need 2-3 different document sets for the FDA, USDA, and state inspectors. With a Canadian plant, one integrated traceability report covers everything." Every bit of simplicity. Every hour saved. Every early detected error. These are what build Canada's quiet victory, a win not forged through bold declarations but through operational efficiency. And the painful truth that used to be America's position, but today divided by competing agencies, burdened by fear of liability, and paralyzed by lawsuit paranoia, the US is losing credibility, not because the competition is stronger, but because the system is falling apart from within. A chilling future Americans eating domestic food under Canadian control. There's something that makes many Americans deeply uneasy, not just the job losses or rising prices, but the creeping realization that we're eating food controlled by another country. If Canada takes over 5 plants formerly owned by Tyson Foods, what they gain first is not just machinery, but the authority to define production standards, who conducts inspections, who sets the safety protocols, who gets access to raw materials. None of that would be in America's hands anymore, and once they control production, they control pricing. A meat facility in Arkansas, operated by a Canadian company, for example, won't respond to domestic U.S. political pressures. It will prioritize the profits and strategies of its parent company in Ontario. Legally, they're doing nothing wrong, but in reality, it's a quiet and dangerous loss of control. Imagine this scenario: a sudden outbreak of avian flu spreads across North America, just like in 2015. America needs to quickly activate its domestic supply chains to secure food for its people, but now 5 major plants are run by Canada. The U.S. government can't force them to prioritize the domestic market. It can't require faster deliveries, price freezes, or shared inventory. All the U.S. can do is negotiate. On its own soil, in plants located in the heart of American communities. Unbelievable. Yet this is exactly what happened with pharmaceuticals during the COVID-19 pandemic. When America relied on drug ingredients from India and China, the system nearly collapsed over the shortage of a single additive. And now the same vulnerability is repeating itself with beef, poultry, and daily food supplies. Supermarket chains like Kroger Safeway, or even Walmart, if they want stable meat deliveries, will have to negotiate with Canadian operators. There's no law stopping Canada from prioritizing exports to Asia if prices are better. And once again, Americans may find themselves the last to be served at their own dinner table. The situation becomes even more alarming when public food programs are considered. Millions of school children rely on free lunches. Thousands of public hospitals need safe daily food supplies, and nonprofit groups deliver meals to families in need, all relying on suppliers. If those suppliers sign contracts with Canadian-run plants inside the US, what happens if Canada faces an internal crisis? What if they restructure and pause shipments for a few weeks? Does America have a plan B? The frightening answer is not yet. State governments don't have enough cold storage to hold reserve food. Domestic producers are either shut down or barely operating due to losses. And trade associations, those once tasked with stabilizing the market, are still scrambling to recover from Tyson's collapse. And so the entire national meal infrastructure, from schools to the military, could now fall under the control of a system beyond the reach of the US government. A policy analyst in Washington warned on NPR Americans think Canada taking over these plants is just a business deal. But in reality, it's a structural shift in power over the food system. This isn't about whether Canada is good or bad. They are acting in their own national interests, just like any country would. But if the United States can no longer produce, inspect, or coordinate its own food system independently, then this dependency could be turned into a geopolitical weapon in the future. And that leads to the question keeping many Americans up at night: who really controls our food? This is no longer about Tyson or Canada. It's about what's unfolding across the board, a nation slowly losing the core ability to feed itself. Psychological fallout and the collapse of trust, a loss greater than market share. A system can recover from a crisis, but trust once fractured cannot be restored through press releases. In supermarkets across Michigan, California, and Pennsylvania, shoppers are turning away from the USDA-inspected label and instead searching for the small line on the back of the package, product of Canada. Not because they hate America, but because they no longer believe that American meat is clean, that American food is safe, or that the American system is still in control. A Pew Research survey from June 2025 made this shift painfully clear. 43% of American consumers said they would choose Canadian food if it appeared on store shelves, even if it cost more. Among those aged 55 and older, a group known for loyalty to domestic goods, distrust had reached 61%. For them, food is not just a commodity, it's life, it's responsibility, it's something sacred at the dinner table. And now that sacred bond is being traded away for chaos born from within. This isn't just a story about products, it's about identity. When people begin to doubt the food they cook for their families, that doubt spreads into schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and industrial kitchens. And from there, trust in institutions in government, in oversight systems, starts to erode. In Ohio, a small community report published in June 2025 revealed that 72% of seniors feel abandoned by federal food agencies. Many said they no longer understand the difference between the FDA and the USDA, only that when a scandal hits, no one takes responsibility. Food is recalled, factories shut down, workers lose jobs, but no one explains why it happened. For everyday Americans, this leaves a lingering sense of unease. They start checking labels more carefully, scanning QR codes to trace food origins, and are surprised to find that Canadian products are clearer, more transparent. People begin saying things like, "This beef is safe, it's from Canada." A simple statement, but one that reveals a dramatic shift in the public psyche. As for farmers once proud to call themselves the backbone of the nation, their faith is in crisis. They've lost land to bankruptcy, lost contracts due to inspection delays, and perhaps most painful of all, they've lost belief that their labor still holds value in the national supply chain. In Kansas, one anonymous farmer shared during a local hearing, "I raise cattle and sell to the slaughterhouse, but they won't take my meat because inspections aren't happening. Meanwhile, the grocery store is stocked not with my beef, but with Canada's. I don't feel like I belong here anymore." When Americans feel alienated on their own soil, this is no longer just an economic crisis. It becomes a crisis of identity. The biggest loss right now isn't an export contract. It's not even the 1,000 jobs lost at Tyson. It's the quiet, unrelenting rupture between citizens and a system they once trusted. What's more frightening than imported food dominating the shelves is the fact that Americans now feel safer buying foreign goods. A nation cannot be strong if its people no longer believe in what they produce, and a society cannot be sustainable if its most basic element, the daily meal, becomes a breeding ground for doubt and division. The greatest loss right now isn't market share, it's trust. And when trust hits rock bottom, everything else, food security, social stability, becomes fragile and temporary. A new dependency spiral. America becomes a customer on its own soil. While the media remains fixated on trade summits and tariff debates, a new kind of dependency is quietly taking shape, beginning with burgers, grilled steaks, and school lunch trays. America has long gone through periods of chronic reliance on China for technology and components, on the Middle East for oil, and on Mexico for cheap labor. But now something unprecedented is happening. The United States is becoming dependent on Canada for its daily meals. The irony: this isn't a battle America lost because it was weak, it's a consequence of letting go. When Tyson Foods shut down 5 plants under the weight of unsustainable production costs, Canada stepped in not to compete for exports, but to stand inside the US itself, operating the very same production lines America once owned. Made in the US by American workers, but directed by Canadian oversight. On the surface, it looks like cooperation. But zoom out, and it's a quiet reshuffling of power. When Canada controls the beef supply for supermarket chains like Kroger and Walmart, or for food service contractors that supply public schools and hospitals, they don't just control the product. They control the price, the standards, and the speed of distribution. So what happens if Canada decides to prioritize its own provinces in the next crisis? What happens when beef prices spike in the US, but Americans can't manage a production chain held by a foreign partner? The United States becomes a passive customer on its own land, and this is just about meat. If this model spreads to other sectors like frozen vegetables, canned goods, or prepackaged meals, then the entire US food system could fall under an invisible web of dependency. No land is taken, but infrastructure is absorbed. No protests erupt. But food sovereignty quietly erodes. In truth, Canada has been preparing for this expansion for years. They're not only strong in livestock, they're rapidly scaling up in frozen produce, canned goods, and clean food processing. Their QR-based traceability is standardized, their logistics are digitized, and their newer factories in Ontario and Manitoba already hold international certifications that many US plants still lack. Meanwhile, food processing plants in the American Midwest are being strangled by slow policy reforms and a shortage of skilled labor. And as domestic supply fails to meet both speed and quality demands, US distributors have no choice but to source from across the border. Not because they want to, because they can't afford not to. More alarming than relying on foreign goods is the loss of agency. When farmers can't control their own output, when factories can't oversee their own distribution, and when consumers no longer know if their dinner is truly American, then the US is no longer a food superpower. It becomes just another consumption market. And in a world where food is becoming a geopolitical tool, even a peaceful dependency on Canada is still a dangerous form of loss. One that forces Americans to ask who really controls our dinner now. We're not here to spread fear, but sometimes painful truths are exactly what need to be heard. When the food on your table comes from a factory run by a foreign nation right here on American soil, the question is no longer, where was it made, but what do we still control? Are Americans losing more than they realize? When you walk into a supermarket, are you truly making a free choice, or are you simply consuming what's left after someone else made the real decisions for you? This video does not promote division or fear-mongering. All data cited comes from publicly available verified sources and is presented with independent analysis. We respect the US Constitution and the laws of this country. If you believe what's happening is worth serious concern, please leave a comment, share this video, and continue asking the question with us: who really controls America from the fields to the dinner table?